All right, 2:30. Shall we start? Hi, Kim.
Hi.
Mila, can you confirm me that attendees are entering the room? Yes, okay. Okay, so let's start. So welcome to everybody to this International Transport Forum webinar on Mix and MaaS data architecture for mobility as a service. Thank you for all being present today. My name is Camille Combe. I'm a transport innovation analyst at the ITF, and I'm the author with my colleague Philippe Crist here of ITF new report on MaaS. So before we start with the presentation of this report, I'll let the floor to Sharon Masterson, who manages the ITF Corporate Partnership Board, which provided funding for this work. So Sharon, the floor is yours, and I will share your slide.
Thank you very much, Camille, and you're all very welcome to this webinar. I just wanted to give you a brief introduction to the Corporate Partnership Board. My name is Sharon Masterson, and the Corporate Partnership Board was set up in the ITF, in the International Transport Forum, in 2014, with a view to ensuring that we took the private sector perspectives into the work that we're doing in terms of policy advice to our member countries. So here you see on screen a list of the corporate partners that we have that are working with us, that are enabling us to do this work, from all of the different modes of transport globally, and also the modes which are close to transport and very much working with them in terms of energy, IT, telecommunications, insurance, etc. So the members of our Corporate Partnership Board suggest projects every year to us that they believe we should look at. This was one of those projects, and a number of the corporate partners worked with us on this project, and you'll hear from some of them today, and also from the rest of our speakers that I would like to thank for being with us to talk about this topic today. So back to Camille. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Sharon, for this. We are super thankful to have members of the CPB and also some external experts who actively contributed to this project. And I will just briefly present the agenda for today. So we'll start with a short presentation of the report by Philippe and I. We'll then have a first session with experts' hot takes on the report, and we will then discuss how mobility stakeholders envisage some conclusions of this report. Please be sure to use the chat function if you have any question on the different presentation and discussion. We'll make sure to keep time to answer them. And now, without any further ado, I will let the floor to you, Philippe, for the report presentation.
All right. Well, thank you very much again. I'm echoing Camille's thanks for attending this. This is a report that we put out, and as many of the ITF reports, it's a foundational one in that we're exploring a whole range of concepts that aren't fully onboarded yet by public authorities and by different companies in the private sector. Although there's a lot of activity around MaaS, we are aiming to help think about how to structure this going forward. And so in this case, we have issued this report, Mix and MaaS, Data Architecture for Mobility as a Service, and you'll understand after this presentation why we're really looking at the architectural elements, because we do believe they are fundamental. We're going to focus today on three main takeaways from that report for public authorities. Again, public authorities are the constituency that the International Transport Forum caters to, especially at the national level, but also at the subnational level when it comes to urban mobility and mobility as a service. The three main takeaways from the report, and there's several, many others in the report, but the three main ones we'd like to focus on are these. We would encourage public authorities and others in this field to think about mobility data as foundational infrastructure. And that means it's a foundational infrastructure that can be regulated and shaped to support the common good. We also really want to emphasize on the fact that mobility as a service, while yet still growing and still growing both in a conceptual sense and in its business sense, is promising in that it can make transport more efficient, both in rural areas and especially in urban areas. But it will require some mandatory data sharing, and we don't really have a structure for that mandatory data sharing or an understanding of how far that data sharing should extend. And this is one of the areas that the report looks on that I'll describe. And finally, managing data infrastructure for mobility as a service for other types of services will require a different set of skills for the public authority side, but also on the private sector side. And we have specific advice on how to build these skills into both the regulatory base and also into the private sector. I'll start with the first one on mobility data as foundational infrastructure. And here it's worth thinking about infrastructure in the real sense of the definition. Infrastructure are the basic systems and services that are necessary for a country or an organization to run smoothly. Now, when we think about infrastructure in the mobility sphere, there are several layers to consider. At the very bottom layer, of course, there's the built environment, and this is where things get built and where activities take place. And this is what generates a lot of travel. Infrastructure in terms of the built environment is highly regulated across the world in zoning, in architectural design guidance, and in building permits and other forms of regulatory interventions. Then there is the transport network infrastructure. These are the roads, the rails, ports, airports that allow different places to be connected, physically connected one to another. Here, public authorities have really been involved in regulating these areas, helping determine the specification for infrastructure, the location, and they also fund a lot of this infrastructure in the public interest. And then on top of this infrastructure are different types of infrastructure-based services. Now, they can be public transport, they can be other forms of new types of mobility services like those around micromobility. In all of these cases, there is a regulatory function for public authorities to help guide the delivery of these services so that they are aligned with social welfare outcomes. Again, a highly regulated domain. And in between all these layers now, and for the past 25 years, and more so in the past 10 years, there is this emerging data infrastructure, this emerging digital infrastructure, which can help integrate services and improves the efficiency of transport. Here in this sphere, in this domain, we see that the rapid digitalization of our society has created a lot of type of services and digital infrastructure that are largely absent of public policy guidance. And yet these are infrastructures that we have to interact with, we have to be involved with in order to live our everyday lives. Now, when we think of mobility data as infrastructure, we're following some of the thinking that we see in some of our member countries, Switzerland in particular, but in Germany for some aspects of it, France for some other aspects of it. And mobility data infrastructure, in our understanding, are data assets, the standards and technologies that enable the data assets to be used, guidance and policies, so this is the regulatory side, the government side, organizations that govern data infrastructure, of course, in the public sphere, but also in the private sphere, and the communities that contribute to developing or maintaining that data infrastructure. This is how we conceive of mobility data infrastructure. And I want to reiterate something I said earlier in that this is foundational infrastructure. Just like transport networks allow us to connect to different places and enable us to live fulfilled lives, increasingly having access to interacting with mobility data infrastructure is also important in being able to live a normal everyday life in many parts of the world. Now, in transport, we have been used to deploying infrastructure. Infrastructure of the concrete, of the material kind, the kind of infrastructure that connects places, as I've said. But now we see that rather than just this connective function, we're seeing this type of soft infrastructure, if you will, the mobility data infrastructure that integrates services. And this is very different than the kind of infrastructure that the transport authorities had to address in the past. It's based on software, it's based on code, it's very immaterial. And yet this is something that will become part of the everyday management of public space, of public infrastructure going forward. In this report, we've used mobility as a service as one way to discuss some of these issues relating to mobility data governance more broadly. And when we talk about mobility as a service, mobility MaaS, if you will, I think there are a few things that are important to understand from our perspective on how we're addressing the entire data governance question around this. And the first is that there is a mobility data architecture that underlies mobility as a service, but other types of digital data infrastructure in the mobility sphere. We break it down in three. There is the kind of data sharing that takes place among market actors, and this enables markets to function. In fact, in the mobility as a service market, it's a secondary market that builds on the trips that different mobility operators provide and creates joined up trip opportunities. And so that requires that data sharing. Then there is this other aspect of the transmission of data, data reporting. And this is data that is reported from market actors to public authorities so that public authorities can monitor and, if they need to, intervene in the market to help adjust it, make sure that it's aligned with public policy outcomes. And then there's this third pillar, which is the way in which we communicate regulatory intent. Now, with a large number of automated systems, machine-based systems, digital systems, being able to translate regulatory intent in machine-readable form, that is directly in computer code, is more and more important. And we see this already happening with different forms of mobility specifications, mobility data specification, for example, which has for the past 3 years had a component that enables public authorities to directly specify or communicate to different players what it is that the law says and what it is that their regulatory preference is. So these are the three components that we think of, the three pillars, if you will, of mobility data infrastructure. Now, the report that we're discussing today addresses data sharing. There's a report that we released last year that looked at data reporting, and we have in our program of work a proposed project to look at machine readable regulation. So watch this space. On the first one, on data sharing, and in particular in mobility as a service, it's important to understand from our perspective that we do not view mobility as a service or MaaS as an app, as an application. We view it as a distribution model for mobility, as a form of mobility ecosystem, if you will, a MaaS ecosystem that at its center puts the traveler. And this traveler, she wants to go places, she has preferences on how she travels, and in order to be able to deliver on those preferences, she'll have to interact with a number of mobility operators. These are the operators that provide trips. These are the ones that provide services that you can ride in or you can ride on. And there's also walking, which some have said should also be part of the mobility as a service, although it is not a commercial product insofar as some of these other services are. Then you have this integration layer. These are the ones that are provided by mobility as a service providers, those that are creating the integrated offers, the subscriptions that bring together mobility service providers' offers. And there are other intermediaries as well that may be data handlers, third-party data processors. These are the ones that bring together those sides in the offer and deliver something that hopefully connects with the specific user, in this case, at the center of the diagram. And then there is the regulatory framework that allows all this to function, the data sharing framework that's established both on the commercial side, but is also on the regulatory side, that enables this meshy MaaS ecosystem to exist. Now, that is for the ecosystem, but I'll talk a little bit about specifically how that ecosystem gets delivered in an app, in a MaaS application. And here, for example, you have our traveler and she wants to travel, she'll turn to a MaaS provider, and that MaaS provider, that mobility as a service provider, will have an app, most likely, that the traveler will interact with and see what offers are available to her. But in order to access that offer, that combined trip offer, in fact, there are a number of different functionalities that have to be addressed by the app in the background. And these run from registration services, identity services, all the way to payment, wayfinding, support services. All of these are the functionalities that have to be delivered by the MaaS app. And in fact, there are certain specifications, the TOMP API, for example, in the Netherlands, that's being used in others, that really identify what all of these different functionalities are and how they should interact with each other. But the important thing that we would like to point out is each of these functionalities, in fact, in the internal architecture of a MaaS provider, are in fact building blocks. And oftentimes they're designed as microservices that can be each separated out and worked on, improved, and then brought back together in that monolithic app offer that you see off to the left here. Now, that microservice building block approach is something that we think is quite promising, and one that doesn't necessarily have to be only internal to the MaaS operator. You can imagine a tertiary market that allows different operators to provide different aspects of these different blocks. It could be identification services, it could be booking services, it could be payment services, and in many cases it already is payment services, but these are external third-party actors that are bringing their functionality to the MaaS app. In this case, we're not thinking of a monolithic MaaS app, we're thinking of something along the lines of a meshy MaaS app, where all these different building blocks are brought together in a coherent structure and delivered to a traveler, or more precisely to many travelers, because this approach allows the customization offered to different types of audiences, different types of users. When we think about data sharing for MaaS, there are three main things that we have to address and manage when we think about the regulation of the governance of data sharing. One is what data to share. The second aspect is how to share that data. And the third one is how to handle that shared data. Now, the second report that I talked about, reporting mobility data, addressed this last component, so I won't really focus on that today, but I will focus on these first two. And the first element to keep in mind is that data is in fact multifaceted. There are a number of different things to consider, and these different facets will have an incidence on the way in which we actually regulate or act in the data market around mobility data. And the first is the source. Where is the data coming from? Is it volunteered by individuals? Is it maybe observed on a platform through clicks? Is it observed in real space as the individual traveler travels, or is it inferred? And this is going to be important because inferred, I'll talk about this in a bit, inferred data is of course data that has a lot, or information rather, that has a lot of value, but the other two are in fact basic building blocks for understanding how the mobility system and how individuals are interacting with the mobility system more broadly. The nature of the data matters. Is it personal data? Is it non-personal? Is it commercially sensitive? In the first case, if it's personal data, then there are many contexts where there are specific legal requirements and restrictions on how that data can be used in Europe and California and a number of other jurisdictions. If it's commercially sensitive, there are also some kinds of considerations that have to be taken into account when we talk about sharing data. The function of the data matters. Is it informational? Is it purely to provide information on a service, a schedule, for example, or the availability of a service? Is it operational? Does that data allow you to unlock a vehicle? Does that data allow you to enter into a turnstile, pass a turnstile and enter into a restricted space? Or is it transactional? Does it involve the transfer of money? From our perspective, we believe informational and operational data have to be shared in order to deliver mobility as a service. Transactional data is probably something that's a bridge too far right now because it does involve money, but there are a number of ways in which bilateral agreements can help ensure that that transaction data is carried out. And finally, who has access to that data? Is it closed off to only those who are within one system? Is it restricted access? Only those who are vetted to have access to that data can have access to that data, and that's probably more the market approach that we're thinking of for mobility as a service. Or is it completely open? And certainly that's not going to be the case for a lot of the data that's required to build a mobility as a service offer, but it may be the case for data on the information relating to travel services like schedules. I noted the difference between data and knowledge, and I just want to touch on that again because when we talk about data, in fact, we often confuse knowledge and data, or information and data. Data is simply just a set of ones and zeros that gives some indication of an entity or a thing. It could be a registered user, it could be a number, it could be a location. Information is when we attach metadata to that. And so we understand that Martin L is that user, or that the 10 refers to the number of Mobib pass swipes that were being affected. And Brussels, the location is in fact a specific place, in this case, Brussels North Station. And finally, transferring that into knowledge is where a lot of the value comes from data. And so in this case, we might understand from looking at the data and bringing together from other data sources that Martin has taken 10 weekday train trips starting at Brussels North Station this month already between 17 and 19 o'clock, and always on rainy days. And so based on his travel history, we might be able to infer with looking at some other sources that Martin is probably a bicycle commuter and only takes the train on rainy days. That has a lot of value, and that probably is something that should not be shared. But the first two, especially the raw data, is something that probably should be shared. It is a non-rival resource that builds the ability to create knowledge, to create inferred value in society. And that's our position in this paper. How to share that data. Now, when we talk about sharing data for mobility as a service, we have tended to think about pooling all that data from all these different mobility operators, bringing them together on a platform or in an administration or to one of the mobility operators' platforms, and then providing access to that data, curating that data. Now, this is the all you need and more whenever approach, but it's always controlled by one actor, and there's problematic issues relating to data access and the fairness with which different actors can actually interact on that platform. That's probably your father's or your grandmother's model for centralized data pooling. What we see now is that there's a lot more possibility through on-demand data exposure, what you need when you need it. And this is data exposure that's initiated by an approved action by a vetted actor. And this is often going to take part using credentialed, secured, token-based APIs, programming interface, application programming interfaces. And these are really the form of what, when we think about mobility data infrastructure, this is the way in which it would be created, which way it's delivered. Data infrastructure built on-demand data exposure APIs. And this is a very different approach to data pooling. It's also one that minimizes the amount of data that has to be shared and allows the purpose of the data sharing to always be the filter through which the data is being shared, not a broad, expansive approach to data sharing as under the pooled approach. Now, recall that we're talking about a MaaS offer that can be built with different components by different actors. So what then does regulated data infrastructure look like specifically in this area? So we're talking about distributed API specifications, application program interface specifications and functionalities. It's a bit like Lego blocks. So again, these are the pegs that allow the interoperability to have value, that allow different blocks to stick together. So the interoperability specification mechanism is part of what the public authority has a role in fostering in this data sharing environment, how these things fit together and work together. But at the same time, there's also this regulatory base. There's the public interest base that guides that whatever is built on that base will be aligned with public interest outcomes. And this is something as well that, as I noted at the outset, is missing in this mobility data infrastructure, which is largely developed not with this base in mind, but with different commercial interests in mind. And finally, before I talk very briefly about interoperability and portability, I'd just like to point out the three ways in which interoperability can manifest itself in any kind of computer system, any kind of digital system, but in particular in trying to create a joined up mobility as a service offer. At the very first level, there's this level of semantics where we have to have some clarity on words meaning the same thing across different contexts. This is necessary, having a common dictionary, or if we don't have the common dictionary, a common way of transposing one word to another so that meaning is always consistent. Now, the second level, and this is taking the book analogy, this is the framework, if you will, the schema of the data system. So you can think every book has a table of contents, it's got chapters, it's got paragraphs, it's got an index. You know more or less with that structure where to find things in a book. And so we're saying in digital systems, mobility as a service, having a common framework. So booking, wayfinding, payment. And that structure is something that if it's consistently applied across different systems, it makes it easier to map one system to the other. And finally, there's the syntax. This is the actual language that's being used, having a syntax that delivers meaning in a uniform way, in a predictable way. And this is akin to the different languages that we might have. Of course, books are published in all kinds of different languages. In this case, there is some, in the context of mobility as a service, some argument to be made for a convergence towards a smaller number of syntaxes than we probably have today, but certainly no need to converge towards a single syntax. And with that, let me run through some of the issues that we highlight in thinking about data interoperability and portability. Now, when we think about these two things, at the first level, we have to have system connectivity. Systems have to be able to connect to each other. Now, in most urban settings, this isn't a problem with 4G, 5G, Wi-Fi. Systems are able to physically or virtually connect to each other. But in rural areas, this may not always be the case. So it's important to keep that in mind, that we can't assume that this kind of system connectivity, at least at the low latency that we require for delivering mobility as a service, is always available. Then we have this semantical interoperability. Now, again, as I just described, are these systems and processes using the same common understanding of terms and the same translation logics? If not, then there's certainly work to be done there to create that lexicon. When we talk about schema interoperability, are these systems be able to interact with each other because they're structured in roughly similar ways, in ways that are predictable, and we understand how to create connectors? If that's not the case, there's probably work to be done on creating some kind of convergence around a common framework, a common schema for this interoperability. And then there's the syntactical interoperability. Can the data generated and used in one system be used frictionlessly in the other? Because they're using the same language, they're speaking the same language, they're using the same code base. Again, this is something that we see emerging. Public transport has its own syntax and syntaxes in different regions. Micromobility has its own syntax, increasingly based on the mobility data specification, or GPFS, the general byte feed specification. But we see a number of these different syntaxes. And so there's some idea that going forward, we might see some convergence or even incentivize that convergence. But certainly, we don't need to necessarily have one single language. And then there is this final uber level of interoperability where we're all actually operating in the same system. And that's certainly not something that we advocate and may never actually see. And finally, I was talking about interoperability. Now there's this need to transfer information about people traveling in the system from one system to another to enable that interoperability, to enable the use of a service that is meaningful for a person. So this might be a traveler taking a micromobility device, then traveling on public transport, then finishing up with another micromobility device. Unless that traveler's information is ported from one to the other of these systems, then there may not be any kinds of real service, real market for mobility as a service. Data portability is something that can happen already in certain contexts. It can be ad hoc. You can specify that your data should be made portable either to yourself or to a third party, but it is not continuous in the sense that this kind of seamless travel would be enabled by continuous data portability. And so we really recommend moving our thinking towards having that kind of continuous data portability with user consent to enable mobility as a service. So this is our minimum specification for mobility as a service. System connectivity, that's for granted. Semantical interoperability, we need to develop that lexicon. The protocol schema interoperability, this is something that we can start incentivizing convergence towards. We don't need full data syntax interoperability. We can probably converge towards less than there are now. We don't need full native interoperability, but we do need continuous data portability, and we need a system of auditability to make sure that the data sharing, in fact, is supportive of the kind of market and social outcomes that we want in this domain. And with that, I'll pass it on to my colleague for the final discussion around skills.
Thanks, Philippe. I think I'm on mute. So yeah, as we just explained, so the last main takeaway of this report is that public authorities will need to improve their capacity, the capacity of their workforce to manage this data infrastructure. And currently what we see is that there is a structural mismatch in the data management capacity within the public sector. And as the other infrastructural layers that Philippe just described earlier, the management of the mobility data infrastructure will require skilled and dedicated resources. And the public authorities have a role to play in shaping and guiding also the mobility data infrastructure and development. And to that end, attracting talents and skills is central and will be central in building this major data sharing ecosystem. But building capacity is not, it's not enough. It's not just about doing things. It's also about understanding. And from a policy perspective, we saw that a lot of inefficient situation can arise from a skill mismatch between the public and private sectors. And we look in the report at 3 ways from which the public authorities could improve their workforce capacity. They could do so with, at first, the improvement of recruitment practices. So basically, they can recruit new people, new capacity to work on data management. But one thing to bear in mind with this first lever is that the transport sector is actually competing with other sectors on data management capacity. And we can take the example of banking, for example, or computing. So all those recruitment practices should also take this factor into account to attract the adapted workforce. The second lever is that public sector organization could also establish skill development strategies to address skill shortages. We identified 2 main skill development strategies. The first one will be upskilling. So it's when people are willing to adopt new skills for their current job. And the second one is reskilling, where people are willing to learn new skills for different jobs. So that's 2 ways to achieve this. And it's mainly done through trainings, whether it's internal trainings or with a third party training program. And the last but not least is mainly for the market players who cannot internally recruit dedicated and skilled human resources. They can still improve the data management capacity by outsourcing data management actions to the private sector. They can also take the advantage of existing tools and solutions that are being developed by other market actors that provide access to this data management expertise. So to finish, maybe a quick recap of the 3 main takeaways. So as Philippe just presented, the first one is to consider the mobility data as foundational infrastructure and to regulate and help shape it for the common good. The second one is that we need some mandatory data sharing rules. And the last one, as I just explained, is that public authorities will need to implement skill development strategies, whether it's hiring, outsourcing, or developing skills. Maybe I think we have a last slide, just to say to you that you can access the report by scanning this QR code, and please be sure also to subscribe to ITF alerts for new reports. We are currently working on other reports linked to MaaS, so if you're interested, be sure to subscribe. And then we'll move to the discussions. So for the first session, I will welcome a speaker that are on your screen now, some of them. So Tuto Tai, Ferdinand Bergersdijk, Jan Kremer, and Kim Watts. Welcome. I wanted to start with you, Tuto, and for all the participants. So this session will be about those experts' hot takes on this report. And I wanted to start with you, Tuto. So you contributed to this report, and you are also involved in ongoing reflections around the establishment of a shared data resource for mass market stakeholders. So first, what are your hot takes on this report, and what do you think are the actions that could be taken now to develop such a shared data resource? And also considering the ongoing development in Europe with the updates on the different data-related regulations, and especially data spaces, how can such infrastructure be designed to avoid potential blockages?
Thank you, Camille and Philippe, for inviting us, all of the experts, and also giving us the chance to contribute to the report. As a first hot take, I would say that what is essential and was highlighted in your report is public authorities have a crucial and pivotal role to play in this very specific field of data sharing when it comes to building MaaS. Why? Because a lot of private sectors representatives will tell you that sharing data can go against competition, but it's not the case. And as your report underlines, informational data is not competitive. So we need to make sure that our policies are built around that to push for data to be shared, but also going further, because data sharing requirements through licensing or the revised European regulation is not enough. And that's why talking about the European regulation, they're pivoting to look into the quality of data, because it's not just enough to have information out there, but if it's not using the same open standards or open norms, such as NetX, Siri, GBFS, and so much others that exist, it cannot be used. If the quality itself of the data is not high enough, it also means that it cannot be integrated in solutions. It cannot be integrated in creating innovation because it cannot be analyzed. And last but not least, if it's not updated at all, the user will end up being so angry at whatever is provided to them through any MaaS app or third-party aggregator or vendor that it will end up going back to use their own car, which defeat the purpose of using data and MaaS to build a more sustainable environment. Last but not least, it was the part that you presented, Camille, about the knowledge sharing and the training that is needed to actually bridge the gap between the knowledge owned by the public sector and the private sector. And for that one, I would actually give tribute to you and the team of ITF and other nonprofit organizations out there, in the sense that you are the perfect platform to actually support this knowledge sharing, making sure that everyone is around the table and can actually learn from each other. Because if we leave it to only the private sectors, well, I think one of the experts, Jan, said it earlier, the GAFAM will win. And it's not necessarily what we want. What we want is to make sure that everyone understands what we're dealing with, and that knowledge can be shared in a way that, again, a level playing field is built. And if I look at your last question about the European update in regulation, I think to avoid potential blockage, it goes back to consensus and open discussion. Let's make sure that what exists is actually used, that we don't spend any more of the public money developing new tools, new standards, new structure that does not fit what the industry wants, what the market is ready for, and what data exists out there. Based on that and making sure that everyone has an equal voice, then we can make sure that we're not building something that will be irrelevant in 2, 3, 10, 20, 50 years.
Thank you, Tito. Thank you for the nice comment on the reports, by the way. 0.2 on our side. I would like to...
2, 3, 20 years or 2 months.
Yeah, exactly. I wanted now to ask you, Kim, so you work at the Coalition for Reimagined Mobility, and you recently published a white paper looking at how Europe could achieve its green digital revolution with seamless mobility, among others. And you recommended in this white paper that going beyond ticketing and establishing a MaaS directive with a European standard for mobility services. So can you please briefly explain us this concept and how this concept basically interfaces with the report's conclusions?
For sure. And thank you so much, Camille. And first of all, congratulations to Camille and Philippe and the whole ITF team and all those who contributed to this really excellent report. It's really is a concise and foundational articulation of where we're at on mobility as a service and data infrastructure and sharing, and where we need to, what we need to do to get past the current policymaker roadblocks, both philosophical and practical. So thank you for the opportunity to participate. Agree thoroughly with what Tito said before me. And looking at the Coalition for Reimagined Mobility's REMO's MaaS directive proposal, this, came out of, we're seeing right now in Europe at the European Commission level, there's a focus on, technical integration and interoperability of longer distance services through the forthcoming multimodal digital mobility services regulation, which is going to be a really important first step in addressing some of the competitive imbalances we've seen. But, what we saw to really accelerate connectivity and ensure that regulation is supporting mobility innovation for people to benefit people, we need to kind of have an agreed European, in fact, global, but let's start with European position on interoperability and digitalization of all kinds of mobility services. So the MaaS directive from us is a policy concept that would set a broad but flexible standard. And we're trying to articulate a vision here. To use the words in your report, we're trying to articulate a vision of what society wants to get from MaaS as a concept for people and for the whole mobility sector. It's broadly modeled on transport reforms we've seen in Finland and Germany, France, and most recently Spain. We're framing mobility as a single service, taking an agnostic view, requiring digitalization, requiring interoperability, just saying that, and requiring data exchange, interoperability, using what we have already. And importantly, we see, I think, giving the freedom to individual member states. So we see the need for a push from the bottom, which is coming already. Cities doing so much to stimulate mobility innovation and trying to in some of the best cities around the world, effectively regulate what services are there and the data exchange and interoperability. And we need also a push from above to help at the member state level so that these benefits can be felt throughout individual countries, not just in the cities that have the best staffing and resources. And so to give that freedom, because of course everywhere is different. This is the problem. Sometimes mobility services are hyper-local. So broader, setting our articulated vision nice and high. And, you know, so making that ticketing functionality and operational data available between different operators, and with the enforcement mechanism, you do need some sticks in there. And requiring accessibility, remembering those who do require more help to be able to access mobility services, enabling experimentation, regulatory sandboxing, specifically setting that within there, and recognizing the individual right, people's individual data portability right to transfer the data to other operators, to get past this. As you saw in the presentation, I was so happy to see it. Can we please get past the MaaS as an app? Never want to see the one app to rule them all. I never want to hear that concept ever again. And it's really, we need to get, you know, beyond that. You know, then that's going to really enable the possibility of innovative ticketing concepts. We're seeing the beginnings of it in Germany already with their new mobility pass, but still only on classic public transport. That it's through this kind of broad vision. And, you know, ultimately, we're trying to set a level playing field. That's the why behind this. Regulatory action can help to set a level playing field to ensure that consumers can choose, you know, the way, make more services available, but also help them to choose how to access that service, you know, without having to imagine that you'll have 10 different apps or a single app, or that this interface could be through another service that's already that you're already using. I know there's been some research that's come out, Sampo Heitinen and David Henscher on this, like mobility as a feature. So through accessing mobility services through banking services, so enabling that integration with other markets and other sectors as well. And the reason why you want to encourage that is if we don't, and you know, it's been hinted at already today, I think as we see the nascent mobility sectors facing a really challenging investment horizon right now, we've seen that, we all recognize that, and we've seen that in our research, that if we don't act to thoughtfully set a vision and thoughtfully regulate this, we're going to get consolidation and aggregation of mobility data and mobility services. That looks good in the short term, but in the long term, I think it leads to really harmful monopolistic consolidation. And so I've touched on some parallels already. Thank you for saying that data is foundational infrastructure, just saying it. It's not just the bells and whistles that you maybe attach on the infrastructure. It's the data itself that's the infrastructure that needs to be thought of, that's been neglected. Thank you. Yes, you know, focusing on MaaS as a concept of connectivity and interoperability, you know, not as the app concept, because if we, you know, in the absence of regulation, you are going to get an app to kill them all. It's going to be not the kind of app that is beneficial to consumers and all those operators in the market. You know, so articulating the vision here is where I see the parallels, and I was just so delighted, saying yes, 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 so many times as I was reading the report. You know, and ultimately, what I see, and this report touches on it, and I hope that our white paper does as well, is, you know, we have to think about, we think about in the mobility sector, there's a lot of talk about how connectivity is essential. Data, digital data, so important. Why? Why? But without, sometimes we don't address how this is going to make people's lives measurably better. What problem are we solving for? And the problem is we're not solving for is how to get more connectivity per se. We're trying to solve for the problem of how to make mobility easier to access and navigate for people, to simplify the human experience of mobility and connectivity, because otherwise, to Tuto's point, people will just go back to what they already use. You know, and this is in the look, we're looking at the high level. We're undergoing a really significant energy and mobility transition that's requiring some fundamental macroeconomic shifts in supply chains, and industrial policy, right? But what do all these changes mean for individuals and how they connect to the world? I mean, that's really important. This is where data is key to facilitate a streamlined experience. And so we need to articulate how digitalization, service-based mobility, and regulation can make people's lives better, because we see that's how you're going to really bring people along with this transition and ensure that we're not leaving anyone behind as we're having these multiple balls in the air. So yeah, there's many great things in this report. Thanks for the opportunity. And our MaaS director tries to articulate help to articulate this vision, but it's just so important to have this kind of report come out of an authoritative source like the ITF Transport Forum.
Thank you so much, Kim. And I saw that we have some questions also on the Q&A function. So please, for all the attendees, please don't hesitate to use it. I will now turn to Ferdinand, another fantastic, wonderful contributor to this work. So Ferdinand, how do you see the role of MaaS service providers in such a microservice-based architectural approach of MaaS that Philippe just described, and who are the market players that you think can intervene in this MaaS market, especially considering the challenges associated with ticketing?
Wow, I think after this answer I can be running for president. But thank you, Camille, and thank you, Philippe, for having me. No, it's been an interesting trip that we had, an interesting process in seeing what works and what doesn't in MaaS. And I think that we are confronted with a world that has been, well, low at its digitalization advancements over the past decades, right? It has been mainly constructed around ticketing. Where you see in ticketing and even the standards around ticketing that a lot of functionalities have to come together, but mostly they're operated by one single platform or organization. And this lock-in or vendor lock-in, like it's often referred to, has a big effect, because if you have all the functionalities in-house, people tend to take shortcuts, right? And this is how a Gordian nut starts to evolve, right? You have these small nuts that come together and you cannot really go back anymore. So yeah, what's the platform role actually, right? If information goes back to the source, so the actual transport operator has theirs properly organized and aligned, and the individual as the other contract party of the actual transaction of mobility, right, has a similar setup, you can combine the two, whether like you're a chef cook in a cuisine, right? It's like, I want to bring these flavors together and maybe a bit more balsamic here and a bit more pepper there. And I think that if you look at it from that, the Lego, like you described, the Lego is not the 2x4. It's the smallest Lego piece is the 1x1 by 1/3. All right. So from there, we need to start building things up. And I think for platforms, the idea of the lock-in has to do with the business model that they were presented over the maybe even starting of the 80s and 90s, when shareholder value became more apparent than actual added value to your customer, right? So it's more about the narrative, or as I like to say sometimes in plain old Dutch, the bullshit, all right? And I live amongst the cows where I'm coming from, so I know how it smells. And it's actually very functional for most things, but it doesn't really help you in all cases. So going back to the smallest building blocks, how could we bring them together? And in which way can we disregard the consent button that we see in all these platforms, right? How can we realign not only the playing field amongst operators and platforms and even authorities maybe, but even in that ecosystem, include the passenger, because it's an equal part, right? And we cannot discard that. And if we combine efforts like contract law, if we combine efforts of economy of scale, right, we see that I think the platforms are going to be similar to banks, right? Banks do mostly the same. If you look at the big banks in Europe, their main differentiator is their logo, all right, the colors of their cards, but most of the transactional interaction is being done on a large scale in the background. So, and with them together, right? Even in the Netherlands, we are now giving out the same ATM systems for all banks because they saw it's silly to do that alongside each other. So we have to see where the differentiators are and where the overlaps are. And where the overlaps are, we should see how we can combine that in order to increase scale and reduce cost for the passenger, the citizens, for the taxpayers. And on the other side, we want the platforms to focus on the solutions that are actually maybe even to a personalized level acceptable. And where can market actors intervene? That's interesting. I wouldn't like it to be the commercial platforms. We just got note in the weekend that an event ticketing platform for an artist from the United States, usual ticket price 100 euros went up to 400. And people standing alongside each other in the audience could differentiate, hey, you paid 400, I only paid 100. We're using the same product, right? And certainly public transport, we're going from A to B. So let's not go into that pricing differentiator as long as public authorities can make sure that we are still doing the things that we need to do. So some regulation required there. Another aspect is that it would be great if people that are financially less well off can be assisted in some way to actually have access to public transport, or maybe even shared cars, shared bikes, right? With the fact that they have possibly a verifiable state, all right, with a local government that they not can only use in their local environment, but also abroad, right? Because you're still 65, whether you're in, like I'm now in Berlin, or you guys are in Brussels or in Paris or anywhere else. So your age doesn't change. So why should, right, the benefits or the tariff factors? So these things, I think, are the niceties. The main change that we're going to create is that the persons involved, the citizen, the traveler, the passenger, the user, however we're going to call them, is going to be more in control of their information. And that's going to be interesting because that will really level out the playing field on a macroeconomical level. It's through democratizing data, for instance, that you can actually have a similar insight from different viewpoints. So authorities, operators, individuals, or even MaaS platforms can play around with the same or similar information, right, to help this market move forward. And this market is in definite need to move forward because through the standstill and the autonomy of the ticketing vending machines, right, and the ticketing industry, right, we have come to a complete standstill and we have to break through that wall.
Thank you very much, Lerino. And finally, for this first session, I will turn to Jan Kramer. So you are involved in numerous works looking at interoperability and the role of data for competition and innovation in digital markets. And the data interoperability and the challenges associated with data sharing between numerous market stakeholders are not limited to the transport sector. So my question was, what can MaaS learn from other sectors that are also dealing with data sharing? And based on your experience working in different sectors, what are the main challenges we must consider?
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. Although I'm not known for MaaS and transport. Actually, my wife has a PhD in logistics, so everything I know about transport and logistics is from her. But of course, I do have worked on data and interoperability and data sharing and so on in the past. And the vision of MaaS is also quite familiar to me, and it's a great vision. I mean, if you tell someone that what if you have a service, you know, not an app, but a service that would allow you to individually plan a trip for you going from A to B, and what modes of transportation you're using is being planned out for you. And it might also change in real time depending on traffic, depending on availabilities and so on. That really ultimately is that vision of MaaS, and that maybe people that go straight to their car usually as the main mode of transportation will see maybe there's a more convenient way where I don't have to take hours and days to plan a trip, and then ultimately it's being turned over upside down because there's some strike going on, or there's some closing of air traffic or whatsoever. But well, the vision, of course, is very nice. It reminds me very much of different visions we also had in the data sphere. We're all still having on personalized data markets, where I can integrate the data I'm creating at all the service providers, and I can sell it and even make money with it. Also some of the things we do have in the DMA, the Digital Markets Act now, or things that are going about to happen in the upcoming Data Act on data portability, where there's a lot of obligations for data sharing. But once you actually start to look in the details and how to do it, and how is it scalable, and how is it also be able to do it in continuous and real time, because it's no use to have the data what the traffic was last week, but you want to know what is going on right now, then it gets very, very complicated very quickly because of a number of reasons. The first is that what is the right, as you pointed out, what is the right infrastructural mode of actually sharing data? There was some agreement here on the panel that APIs and tapping into the data from the different sources is the right way, or is the best way. I'm not sure I'm agreeing. I'm also not disagreeing necessarily. I'm just saying there's much more levels of detail that need to be considered here. If you think of a data trust, for example, so maybe a neutral third party that could pull in the data from the different providers, and then also would be in a unique position to combine the data also in a privacy preserving way, and then to hand it out. It would also control who gets the data better. But probably that needs to be done by sort of a public authority or publicly funded, needs to be independent. So if a private actor does that, and then of course the GAFAMs come into mind, then that probably is not a good scenario. So decentralization is good on the one hand, but then centralization, as I said, in data trust have many advantages too, because ultimately you're also in the realm, and that is something that's always very complicated, especially in Europe, is when it comes to involving personal data, and where users need to consent to certain uses of the data. And then you have, on top of the whole data sharing infrastructure and complexities, you have the complexities of acquiring and giving and revoking consent. Which is a separate layer and can be very, very, very difficult. So there also these data trusts might be helpful. Some of the modes of transportation probably don't require consent. So if you're, where buses are going or trains are going, there's a number of people in there. But if you're taking an Uber, or if you're sharing data on where different ride-hailing, where taxis or where different ride-hailing providers are having their cars right now, then which individual people might be taking, and you can sort of map out trips through that of course might be problematic. I also disagree to the fact that there was some consensus on that informational data is not competitive, and it is competitive. I mean, we've seen the digital markets quite some time, that whoever has the ability to pull in more information and more data is in an advanced competitive position, especially if you can also combine it with other insights, private insights you have about a customer, if you have, for example, payment systems already in place. Because ultimately, I don't think we should be naive in the sense that you mentioned quite prominently, MaaS is not an app, but there are very much centralization, agglomeration forces at work here, data-driven network effects at force, that ultimately probably will lead to something like a super app in which this is happening. I can also understand consumers if they don't want to have a different MaaS app in every region or country they're in. They have already Google Maps or something like installed, if the data is available also to these firms, it'll come in, and they have payment options as well. They already do ticketing here and there. They do authentication with different providers already. So they are in a unique position, and we should be very aware of that, I guess. That there are concerns that it will boil down and gravitate to these few firms, and they also have the skills already in place. I mean, which is a huge problem even at the municipal level or at the smaller level to get the right skills in. All right, I'll stop here. You see, there's many questions in the detail, and you know, again, thank you for having me, despite me poking a little bit in these difficult questions.
Thanks, Jan. That was great. I see that we have a few hand raised. So what I propose is that Ferdinand Tutor, you can ask your questions and remarks in a very short time so that we can move to the session 2 in a short amount of time. Thanks.
Thank you, Jan. Yeah, it's always good to have outsiders come into these discussions and opening these variables. I think we have grown quite a way, and I really like that we have to reduce the noise. Right, in the past 10 years, I think that MaaS has gone from a lot of enthusiasts now back to a specific group that understands that if we do not appreciate the many-to-many data interaction, which microservices actually support, or that actually support microservices, and look towards the international data spaces, reference architecture, and also the European digital identities which are coming into play now. So I think that, yes, I would love to have that button on Google Maps that says, get me this ticket, right? I would love to have the control over my personal data. And if you look from a legal perspective, I do not want to give consent to anyone beyond that, because the legal contract is already enough, right, for data exchanges without me having to give away all my data, transactional data, personal data, etc., towards other towards a platform and the consumers and other organizations behind that I don't even know. All right. So for me, I'm very happy with your Google remark, because if you look at microservices, they have an excellent, very equipped planning solution, but I wouldn't like to have them for my banking solution, and nor would I like to have banks as my mobility solution. Right. So I would like to divide them from a privacy point of view. So thank you for your remarks. Yeah.
And very quickly on what you said, Jan, about informational data being competition sensitive. Yes, unfortunately, it is the case today, because today what we see are the big players who can compute a lot of informational data of various level of data quality are winning. So what I really like about the ITF report, and I think it's important to underline that we need policymakers to push for the informational data not to be competition sensitive anymore. No one should be able to, actually pay to know where the bus stop is, how much it costs to rent a bike in a bike sharing system, because all of that should be made publicly available, because that will not change the quality of services provided by any trip planning application or a bike sharing system. Google Maps should not win because they're the only one capable to compute the information that honestly has no real service to the cities and so on.
Just a very quick reply to that is, yes, I mean, data being available and taken in, but we should not forget that, you know, there are algorithms in the background that need also feedback on how the trip went, you know, was it successful? Which time did it take eventually? And this is data that is privately held ultimately, and it's probably also difficult to make available. And there's only very few firms, namely those that have your, you know, put the cell phones and the apps into our hands, that it can actually get that feedback kind of data. And then it becomes a matter of, you know, which app do I install of the multitude of potential apps I can install? Which app do I install? Well, the one that gives me the most in terms of the best quality feedback, the best, you know, has learned the most, that can actually do the ticketing on top of it, that I can tap already in the turnstiles, you know, to get through, and so on and so forth. So it becomes competitively automatically, I would say, ultimately, unfortunately.
Thanks, Jan. Thanks, Ferdinand. Thanks, Kim and Tuto. I'll suggest we move to the second session. Philippe, the floor is yours.
I sense that we could go on not just talking amongst ourselves, but I can sense also from all the questions and comments that have put in the Q&A and in the chat that there are a lot of things that we will not be able to discuss today. I can say from looking through the Q&A right now that about 60% of those we address in the report. And so I would, if you have posted a question there, and many of them are really, really good questions, many of those are actually addressed in the report. A shout out to Soren Sorensen, who's been quite active there. There are a lot of really good points. Ariel in Japan has raised a few points that we will try to get to at the very end. N-Tour is a good example from Norway. That's one of the things you can see there. But I think right now what I'd like to do is turn to three other actors, one representing a mobility service operator, another one representing a region, an authority that's involved in regulating mobility services, and then the third one who is simply put both on the mobility as a service provider side, but also is, I don't know if he likes the term, the grandfather, certainly one of the first real people to popularize the idea of mobility as a service and had the temerity to make a business out of it. So Sampo Haitinen, Martin Lefranc from Brussels Capital Region, and Pauline Aymonier. I'm going to turn to Martin first. Our constituency are regulators. You work for an authority that is regulating mobility in the Brussels Capital Region. Full disclosure, the Brussels Capital Region and the ITF have a relationship in that we have worked together to map out what does a sensible regulatory framework look like for mobility as a service in the capital region. And we're now working on deepening that work and thinking about how to take those principles and extend them to other regions that are neighboring and that in fact go across borders outside of Belgium. So Martin, you heard the discussion or presentation that we have today. You've heard the hot takes, the really good inputs that we got from Jan on some of the, I wouldn't call them shortcomings, but real tough issues that we have to think about when we're thinking about building up this architecture. How is it from the Brussels Capital Region that you are advancing in this area, and how is it that you feel you might position yourself in the future to address this need to think of mobility data as infrastructure and to situate a common framework for making sure that mobility as a service delivers the best possible outcomes for the citizens of your region?
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Philippe and Camille, for having me. I'm honored to be part of this conversation. And yeah, to add to Tuto and Kim's points earlier, I really wanted to congratulate the ITF team and every contributors for the report, because one first feedback that I can maybe give and share here, I think it's important to do it, is to tell you how useful and helpful these kind of reports actually are in these recommendations. Sometimes when the report is out, you don't have the feedback, and I think it's important to let you know about that, and that the recommendations and what you share in these reports actually are sustained in for quite a while after the publication. And as you said, Philippe, I work for Brussels Mobility, which is the multimodal transport authority for the Brussels Capital Region. And at our level, we are responsible for the large governance of MaaS development, or mobility services. So that means that we are involved in the regulations of these services, and we are currently drafting and working on a regulation specifically for MaaS services. But in general, we are responsible for the steering of what the MaaS ship is. Really, it involves a lot of people, a lot of other agencies at the regional level, but at other levels as well. As you mentioned again, we are working on this new project and to try to make sense of all these stakeholders, and from the public authorities perspective as well, involved on the topic of MaaS. And these kind of recommendations and reports and visuals that you share during the presentations are really useful in the sense that it saves us hours and weeks and months to actually share some knowledge, some principles that we might have known, at least in part, but it gives even more credibility, and we really share understanding, the same understanding of these principles, and we can go to the next level in that sense. So that's really, really helpful. I wanted to talk also about the fact that indeed we are working in this good move kind of framework, which is a sustainable urban mobility plan, which defines a vision for the city, for transport by 2030. And we've defined MaaS as an action, as a tool to reach that goal, to reach that vision. So MaaS is not an end goal in itself, it's a tool to reach it. So it's important to know that, and we are thinking more in terms of multimodality and how we can make people more multimodal in general. And the MaaS is not an app, or not only an app quote. I've used it many times. I use it on a regular basis. But we believe as a region that access to multimodality is a public service. So we are working together with our partners at STIB MIVB on a public MaaS app. It's a regional project, just to give a minimum easily accessible MaaS application that everybody can download in Brussels. But to balance that kind of policy and project that we have, we are also working on every other kind of policies and regulations to make it as open and as transparent as possible, so that everybody can actually have an opportunity on the market. So we work, closely and in parallel on these two projects to make it as balanced as possible. So that's one of the points I wanted to share with you today. And maybe to come back to your question, I can share a very concrete example that I was confronted with in the past few weeks, and that kind of connects the dots between different principles, like the Good Move framework that we're working on, the STOP principle, or I don't know, everybody knows about it, but the STOP label, maybe not. So STOP principle comes from the Dutch stappen, trappen, openbaar vervoer, privé vervoer, which gives a hierarchy of modes of transportation. STOP principle is really connected to the Good Move framework, and we want to prioritize walking and then biking, public transport, and private car trips. So connect the dot with the STOP principle, mobility services, and the data sharing and reporting kind of principle as well. Here in Brussels, we are really in a critical point in terms of governance and regulations for shared micromobility services. These services have been there for a while. We have an ongoing regulation, but we are currently working on a new one, and there's a new framework that should be applicable by the end of the year. In that initiative, in that momentum, we are in close contact with, of course, shared micromobility providers, and we try to enforce some principle as well. And we have some machine-readable regulation that we're working on based on an MDS format, etc. So we're learning on all these topics as well. And of course, we have tried to limit the speed of shared micromobility vehicles, especially in some areas such as pedestrian areas. So I was looking for the data set of where these pedestrian zones are in Brussels, and I thought we had it. It made sense that we had a very qualitative data set of these areas. And I was looking on the map. I zoomed in specifically where I live, and I realized that one of the main pedestrian zones that is next to my place didn't exist on digital level. We didn't know where it was because there are so many stakeholders involved. So I thought to myself, here we are now trying to push the STOP principle in a MaaS application, but we are pushing in that direction without actually knowing the most basic kind of data, such as where are the pedestrian zones, and how can you make the so the walking principle, the walking part of the STOP principle, as effective in a MaaS application if you don't have that? So I realized how much it is important to know that, and we are, the local authorities, the best positioned stakeholders to actually know that and to have that knowledge at the micro, very local level, compared to the GAFAMs or whatever. So in addition to the MaaS is not only an app quote, I'll definitely use data as infrastructure again in the future, as well as another one actually also from you, Philippe, I believe, which is the ultimate MaaS app is the city, which I strongly believe in.
That's right, Mehta. I think we're at a moment in time where it's as if we're in 1911. We have this new technology, the motor car. We don't have any standardization of roads, of sidewalks, of pavements, or anything. But we know it's going to be big. And we have a choice to make. Who is involved with the creation of the infrastructure that allow this technology to thrive? In our case, maybe thrive a bit too much. And who will manage that? Will it be the public sector or the private sector? And I think we're at that kind of foundational movement now for digital mobility. Who will build that infrastructure? Who will specify that infrastructure? And who will guide that infrastructure? And what we do now is going to have an impact for the next 100 years, just like what happened in 1911, 1920. I'm going to turn to an operator now. Tier Mobility is present, of course, in a number of cities, including Brussels. You are on the mobility operator side, you're providing services, but you're also, and this is one of the things that we find really fascinating, you're also starting to combine different services within your environment, within your application environment. In our report, we say that this is certainly something that does create value. We say it should be managed, that there should be some kind of competition safeguards. But Pauline, I'd like to ask you, at Tier, how do you view your participation in this kind of mobility as a service ecosystem as it is now? And how might that evolve? What kinds of mobility as a service ecosystem would you rather be in? Not the one, if it's not the one that we currently have today. And I'm keeping track of time. We have about 15 minutes. So in about 6 to 7 minutes, that would be perfect.
I'll be quick. Thank you so much, Philippe, and hi everyone. Lovely to be here and see so many familiar faces. I'm Pauline, I work for Tier Mobility. And yeah, I'd like to thank the ITF overall for this great report that asks the right questions and that essentially makes sense of what is a very complex topic. So you mentioned Tier is very active indeed in the MaaS ecosystem. So we have over 70 integrations in more than 250 cities. And we actually just reached the milestone of having 5 million rides being completed through our MaaS integrations, which is being celebrated this week. So yeah, Tier has been involved in MaaS from the very beginning. And, now there's been 4 years, we have all these integrations active. We're finally taking a bit of a step back and really trying to see, okay, what are those things that we need? What do we want to do? Where do we want to go with MaaS? And what is needed from a policy perspective for it to flourish? And I think, you made a point just now, Philippe, what is needed for actors like Tier to actually stay involved in the MaaS ecosystem? Because at the end of the day, we do need to make sure that MaaS serves a policy objective, which is to support sustainable mobility, right? And we need to make sure that MaaS also works for mobility actors like Tier or many other players across Europe to make sure that they integrate and that we promote such sustainable modes, right? And I think there's a few points I wanted to come back on from the report, which I found absolutely worth mentioning for mobility operators like us. I think what is really needed to make sure we get actors on board is first to regulate MaaS data sharing at an international or EU level to really avoid fragmentation, right? I think at this point, we are very much seeing more fragmentation and data sharing standards being created from various member states across Europe. And, I think this is definitely something that will hinder MaaS development overall, right? It's very costly for operators like us, but also for the platforms themselves to integrate with so many standards, especially in an industry that's moving so quickly and where we need to keep certain level of flexibility to cater for future business models for MaaS, really. So I think that for us is really a key point. Another one really is how we need to integrate, we need to design more regulations around ticketing and the opening of public transport APIs, right? I think all of us in this room agree that we need public transport to be the backbone of MaaS. Nevertheless, we're not necessarily taking the measures to make that happen, right? We need to make sure we're able to create attractive offers, commercial offers for the end user that are shaped around public transport. I think Tier typically we piloted a few ticketing pilots in Switzerland and Finland, notably, that proved very successful. Nevertheless, regulations across Europe still make it very difficult for operators to be able to resell public transport tickets and to be able to shape their commercial offers around that. I think it's also right to mention, when we're talking about data sharing relationships, as is outlined in the report, that operators are sharing a lot of data to make MaaS happen, right? But when we're not getting access to a certain level of public transport data as well, it creates an uneven data relationship between them in the mobility ecosystem, which I think, again, really presents a barrier for all mobility actors that would want to get involved in MaaS, right? I think another very important point that is raised very clearly in the report, but perhaps with a different lens, is the need for more data reporting. I totally agree with you, Philippe, in the report that we need data sharing and reporting towards public authorities to really understand the impact of MaaS overall. And I'd like to extend that to transport operators as well, right? When operators like us integrate in a MaaS platform and share data for that purpose, we have very limited overview of, how our services are actually being used in a platform. And, I think I've expressed that TIER has wanted to integrate, and that we have 70 integrations globally, but we'd love to actually understand how our services are being used. What's the mode shift effect? How are we complementing public transport, etc.? And I think, that data reporting, I totally agree, needs to happen towards public authorities, and perhaps even beyond that, to make sure that we have a level playing field between the mobility actors that integrate. And I think, we spoke a lot as well about open data to support MaaS and commercially sensitive insights. And I think, there's so much that can be said about that. And I fully agree that, open data will likely support the development of MaaS, although it could also support its fragmentation in a way. And I think we really need to look at this question in great detail. I think, Tuto, you said informational services data is not commercially sensitive. I want to disagree with that also, in the sense that I agree with you, we can create somewhat of a level playing field if everyone shares that data. Nevertheless, it doesn't make the content of the data less commercially sensitive, right? I think, at this point, with the type of data that the micromobility world is sharing openly, a lot of our financials in a given city can be essentially assessed from the data. And it's very important to make sure that, we create an open data framework that supports MaaS, but that does not kill competition in the industry, because, again, we need those players, we need the sustainable mobility actors to integrate in MaaS. And if we put such high barriers to entry, I'll call it, no one will want to actually support its development. I think, it's good to keep in mind, we talk a lot about data sharing for MaaS because it's absolutely needed, but we also need to understand that the business case for MaaS is still unclear. And whilst I think a number of actors like TIER are really aiming to pilot it, we should make sure that there is also an incentive for more actors to join in and not set too high barriers like open data typically. And I hope I was on time, so I'll stop here.
Perfect. A lot of really good insights. I think one other thing that I would add to Pauline, your comments, is that data science itself is changing. And so there may be new mechanisms whereby actionable insights from data can be extracted without actually sharing commercially sensitive data with zero knowledge proofs and things like that. So there is something, again, 1911, what will it be like in 30 years? Well, there will probably be a lot more mechanisms available to us to create these joined up offers that don't necessarily reveal a lot of information to competitors in the market. Watch that space. I said earlier, I called him the grandfather of mobility as a service, and that was, I'm sure he doesn't like that. But exactly. But I have to say that Sampo Haitanen had the merit and the misfortune of being one of those who first took this idea of mobility as a service and really thought about, well, how do we deploy something that is commercially viable with this? And Sampo, with your experience, I'm going to ask you to situate yourself today in what we've just discussed, which is a very different kind of mobility as a service ecosystem. then again does not exist. But we're describing something that is very different from what you faced back a few years ago when you were starting to put in place your first commercial offers. Would it have been different in terms of the rapidity with which you've been able to develop and the ability to scale up if some of these recommendations had been in place then? So how would it have made your life easier? And secondly, where do you see this mobility as a service ecosystem going? Because you are an integral player in a number of world markets around mobility as a service with different approaches. And at the ITF, we're outlining one proposal for how we're going forward. It doesn't mean that it will happen. So what's your take on where we're going with all this going forward? So would it have helped you to have this report 10 years ago and then have countries act on it?
There's a simple answer to that. Yes, it definitely would have. That I'm quite sure of. Out of the 17 million lines of code we have, we've done about 150 different integrations. About 2 million lines of that code is actually just adapters. Thanks to yours is the easy one, but they're a much more complicated one. Doing KYC for car share in Japan is a different thing. So yeah, we are actually doing this. It's the misfortune of going about it. There is a bit of a, so I'll try to be quite pragmatic because we're actually facing those actual users actually having to sell this, actually having to do, and I suppose this is one of the biggest issues that we're over governing a bit at the moment. We have to remember that the total market of consulting MaaS is bigger than the actual consumer MaaS. So we're very, very early stage. So thinking about all kinds of big schemes and stuff, and I suppose that's one of the kind of coming into this. I see a bit too many coming from the angle of either industry, city governance and such, and we're not often focusing enough on what the user rights are. And I think that should be by far whatever the users anyways buying this, and they'll have to accept this. So coming from the actual world of selling, what do we find important? First of all, just data. We talk about data in a very, very vague way. Just data, I'll be a bit rough on this, is worth nothing for the consumer. We have Google's good enough for most of them. So if payment, full integrated things are not part of this, then there's not much to it. And there's not really a business case, there's not really a user case. We cannot really go to the consumer without having the payment. So it's an extremely vital part of all that. I'm strangely maybe of the opinion that there needs to be a lot of flow of data. It needs to be governed. The best way that I've seen around the world is actually using incentives. They're much faster to work than regulation, or even city regulation tend to work quite well. But we do get a lot of these wish lists, especially in the cities where it violates wildly the GDPR. So knowing every second where a person is come on, that's a bit too wild. So let's be realistic also on the demands of what the data is. In reality, actually, on the flow of the full data, which means the payments, the hardest part is actually not on the private side, it's on the public side. They're by far the most protective of the actual needs for the users so far. So those would be it. What I would like to say is the flow of data has not really been the biggest issue as such. So while we're standardizing, let's remember from the other fields, if take telecom or many of the others, just doing that is not good enough unless you also make sure that the minimum standard contracts are part of the whole deal. Because you can stop all data flow by making it impossible by contractual things. So just doing the data architecture will not open up the MaaS within Europe as such. And then I would say as a last point, maybe when we do then good regulation, which I would say from my home country, Finland, the regulation for flow of data is good, but it's not worth much if it's not implemented. So the enforcement and implementation are just as vital part of any kind of regulation than just writing it down. Short points. I could talk for hours, you know that.
Well, we know you can, and you have a lot more to contribute than what we can ask you in 6 minutes. Unfortunately, we're coming to the end of this webinar, and to all those that have both provided inputs into the Q&A, there are a number of links there that we will share. There's some questions, a few of them rather relate to this issue, Sampo, that you just touched on, which is the way in which we report data and the way in which we share data to public authorities. And in fact, as I said at the outset, we did a report looking specifically at that. And that's already out there. But the main gist of it, this goes to what Stein Vernelen also said in his comments, that when public authorities ask for data, it should be the minimum required data they need to carry out a specified and public policy outcome. Should not be a general call. It has to be purposive. So that's one thing. But Sampo, I think that this discussion and the few pointers that you've given, Pauline, from your side, a few of the insights that you've provided as well, and Martin, the very practical implementation challenges that you face in the Brussels Capital Region, both show that we are not there yet. But getting there is actually what we are doing together in this webinar, but also with the work that ITF does on this theme, and many of you do as well. What I do feel, though, before handing it back to Camille for the close, is that we're getting a better idea of what there looks like and what it will need for us collectively to get there. And I think, again, this I'm thinking of data as infrastructure and infrastructure roles and who provides it and how do you guide that is one of the ways that we can really move forward to providing a real digital common good going forward. And back to Jan's point, if we only did this in the mobility sector without any reference to the very same questions that are being asked in other sectors, it would not make much sense. And so there really is the need to align on the top level principles of what we're doing in terms of mobility sharing, mobility reporting, for, of course, mobility, but for health, for banking, those principles should be the same unless there is a real reason that they shouldn't be. And for now, there aren't many reasons they shouldn't be. And that creates a data infrastructure that is going beyond mobility, but in which mobility can fit. And I think that's the contribution that we hope that this report will bring to it, and your ongoing work, all of you, the commenters and those that are in the audience. Camille, final few words?
Yes. I need to mute myself. So yeah, before we end this meeting, I would like to thank all of you for participating, all the participants, but also all the speakers. So Martin, Pauline, Sampo, Ferdinand, Tuto, Jan, and Kim for participating. Of course, Philippe for presentation, and also for Mila and Apostolos who provided the technical support for this event. And again, don't hesitate to consult the reports. As Philippe said, much of the answers on the Q&A section questions are in the report. So we're sorry that we don't have time to address those questions, but please feel free to read the report. It's free and available online. Thank you very much.